The radio crackled with static as I adjusted the Dagon's ballast controls one last time. "Robert, please, just listen to me for once." Mom's voice came through tinny and desperate, even though I'd already told her I was hanging up. "The sonar readings I've been tracking. Something's moving down there. Something big." I hit the disconnect button and pulled off my headset. Third call this morning, each one more frantic than the last. Ivan looked up from his equipment checklist, those careful brown eyes of his doing that thing where he wanted to say something but wasn't sure he should. "Everything okay with Gloria?" he asked, because of course he'd heard her through the radio. The whole boat probably had. "Just Mom being Mom." I sealed the last equipment panel and tried to sound casual about it. "You know how she gets." But Ivan didn't know, not really. He hadn't spent the last 5 years watching her spiral deeper into whatever this was. The late-night calls about patterns in shipping data, the conspiracy theories about cover-ups in marine biology, the growing collection of homemade sonar equipment she'd been building in Dad's old workshop, claiming she was monitoring things that supposedly lived in deep water. I'd been documenting it all. Every bizarre episode, every paranoid theory, every time she'd called me crying about creatures that don't exist. The psychiatrist I'd been consulting said I had enough evidence for an involuntary evaluation, but I needed one more piece. Something concrete that would prove, once and for all, that her mind had finally snapped. This dive would give me exactly that. "She's been tracking sonar readings?" Penny asked from across the prep area, looking up from her laptop where she'd been cross-referencing historical shipping data. "What kind of readings?" I shrugged, focused on testing the Dagon's communications array. "The kind that exists only in her head. She thinks something lives down there that shouldn't." Penny went quiet for a moment, which was weird because she usually had opinions about everything related to maritime research. When I glanced over, she was staring at her screen with this strange expression, like she'd just remembered something she didn't want to think about. "Did she mention what specifically?" "She thinks there are creatures down there that hunt people," I said, letting the irritation creep into my voice. "Humanoid things that live in the deepest parts of the trench. It's textbook paranoid delusion brought on by unresolved grief." Ivan raised an eyebrow at that. "That's pretty specific for a delusion." "Dad died of a heart attack 5 years ago, right in front of her," I explained, checking the Dagon's external cameras. She blamed herself for not getting him help fast enough. Now she sees threats everywhere, especially in the deep water where she thinks she failed him somehow. It's a classic trauma response. What I didn't mention was how she'd started talking about her own research team from 30 years ago, claiming they'd died in this exact location because of some creature attack. I'd looked up the records. The team had died in a pressure suit malfunction during a routine dive. Mechanical failure, not monsters. But in Mom's increasingly fractured mind, even documented accidents became evidence of her imaginary sea creatures. "The funding committee needs solid data on deep-sea biodiversity," I said, more to myself than anyone else. "Normal fish, normal behavior patterns, normal everything. That's what I'm going to give them. And that's what I'd give the psychiatrist too. Video evidence of a perfectly ordinary deep-sea environment, proving that whatever Mom thought she'd seen down there existed only in her traumatized imagination." Penny closed her laptop with a snap. "Robert, about those shipping records from the 1800s. "What about them?" I asked, only half listening as I ran through the pre-dive checklist. "There are some inconsistencies in the reports from this area. Ships that went missing with very little wreckage recovered." I laughed, but it came out harsher than I'd intended. "Let me guess. They all describe mysterious creatures right before they sank." Penny's face went carefully neutral. "Something like that." Jesus, not you too. I sealed myself into the Dagon's cramped cockpit and started the descent sequence. Look, I get that maritime folklore is fascinating from an academic perspective, but I'm trying to do actual science here. Through the small viewport, I could see Ivan and Penny watching as the crane lowered the submersible toward the water. Ivan gave me a thumbs up, but he still looked worried. Penny had that same strange expression she'd worn while reading her files. The Dagon hit the water with a gentle splash, and suddenly the world outside turned a brilliant blue-green. I could hear the hum of the life support systems, the quiet beeping of instruments, the subtle creaking of the pressure hull as we began our descent. Dagon to surface, I said into my headset. Beginning descent to target depth, all systems nominal. Copy that, Dagon. Ivan's voice came back clear and steady. We'll be monitoring from up here. I settled back in my seat and watched the sunlight fade as we dropped deeper. This was it. My chance to finally prove that the only monsters in the Puerto Rico Trench were the ones living in my mother's damaged mind. The depth gauge read 50 meters and climbing as we left the surface world behind. 3 hours down, and the world outside my viewport had turned into something from another planet. The depth gauge read 6,127 meters, deeper than I'd ever gone before, deeper than most humans had any business going. Everything here moved like it was swimming through liquid starlight. I adjusted the external floodlights and watched a massive jellyfish drift past, its bell pulsing with electric blue patterns that looked almost like circuitry. Dagon to surface, I said into my headset. Documenting bioluminescent activity at current depth. Getting some incredible footage of what appears to be a large Atolla specimen. Copy that. Ivan's voice crackled back through the static. How are the pressure readings? All systems green. I focused the camera on a cluster of anglerfish hanging motionless in the water column, their lures glowing like tiny fishing hooks made of light. This was exactly what I'd hoped to find. Normal deep-sea life doing normal deep-sea things. Biodiversity is incredible down here. The funding committee's going to love this. But even as I said it, something felt off. The anglerfish weren't scattered randomly like they should be. They were lined up in a perfect formation, facing the same direction like they were waiting for something. And that massive jellyfish I'd just filmed, instead of drifting with the current, it had pressed itself against my viewport and stayed there for almost 30 seconds, its bell contracting in a slow, deliberate rhythm. I shook my head and collected another water sample. Isolation psychology. That's all this was. 3 hours alone in a metal box under crushing pressure was bound to make me see patterns where none existed. The Dagon's lights swept across a rocky outcropping, and something moved behind it. Something that definitely wasn't a fish. I killed the forward momentum and hovered in place, studying the rock formation. Nothing. Just ancient basalt covered in some kind of bioluminescent algae that painted everything in pale green light. Then I saw it again. A small figure, maybe 4 feet tall, slipped out from behind the rocks and into the edge of my light beam. For a split second, I got a clear look. Elongated limbs, oversized head, large eyes that reflected my lights like mirrors. It looked almost human, but stretched and adapted for a world without sunlight. My hands froze on the controls. The thing was just floating there, watching me. "What the hell?" I whispered. The creature tilted its head to the right. Without thinking, I leaned right to get a better look, and the thing immediately mirrored my movement, tilting its head in the exact same direction. I straightened up. The creature straightened up. I raised my left hand to adjust the camera controls, and the creature raised what looked like its left arm in perfect synchronization. No way. I pressed my face closer to the viewport. "You're copying me." The creature's mouth opened slightly, and I could swear it was mimicking the shape of my lips, forming words. I tried to radio the surface, but my hand was shaking too badly to hit the right button. "Ivan, are you seeing this on the external camera feed?" Static. Then, "Seeing what, Robert? Your cameras are showing normal deep-sea environment. Lots of small, bioluminescent organisms." I looked back out the viewport. The creature was gone. "Nothing," I said, scanning the darkness. Thought I saw something unusual, but it was probably just a large squid. But that wasn't what I'd seen. What I'd seen had been watching me with intelligent eyes, learning my movements with the focused attention of something that understood exactly what it was looking at. I started the sample collection sequence, trying to focus on the work. Normal fish, normal behavior, normal everything. That's what the data would show. Because that's what was actually down here. A school of lanternfish swept past, their photophores blinking in perfect unison like synchronized Christmas lights. Behind them, barely visible in the darkness, something else moved with the same coordinated rhythm. I aimed the camera in that direction and hit record, but whatever it was stayed just outside the light beam. When I tried to rotate the external floods to get a better view, the movement stopped entirely. "Playing games," I muttered. Then louder, "Dagon to surface, collecting final samples at current depth, then beginning survey of the lower canyon system." "Copy that, Robert." Ivan's voice sounded strained. "Listen, I just got off the phone with Penny. She's found some concerning information in the historical records from this area." "What kind of information?" A pause. "Multiple ships reported seeing unusual figures in the water before they went missing. Small humanoid shapes that appeared to be watching from a distance." I felt cold despite the environmental controls. "When was this?" 1847, 1873, 1901. All in this exact location. All described the same thing. Creatures that seemed to study the crews before the ships disappeared. I looked back out the viewport. The darkness looked different now, less empty. Like it was full of things I couldn't see, but that could definitely see me. Maritime folklore, Ivan. Sailors have been reporting sea monsters for centuries. Doesn't mean they're real. Maybe. But Penny says the reports are remarkably consistent. And Robert, some of these ships had over 100 crew members. They just vanished. No wreckage, no survivors. I moved the Dagon forward slowly, following the rocky slope deeper into the canyon. The external lights revealed more normal deep-sea life. Tube worms, sea cucumbers, the occasional crab. Everything exactly where it should be, doing exactly what it was supposed to do. Except for the small figure that kept pace with me just outside the light beam, matching my speed and direction with effortless precision. I stopped the submersible and waited. The figure stopped too. I moved forward. It moved forward. I turned the external camera toward where I thought it was hiding, and something flashed past the lens too quickly to identify. When I looked back out the viewport, the creature was on the other side of the submersible, still maintaining its distance but clearly visible now. It waved at me. Not the random movement of a curious animal, but a deliberate human gesture. A small hand raised in greeting, held for 3 seconds, then lowered. Jesus Christ. I hit every external light I had, flooding the area with white light. The creature didn't flee. Instead, it swam closer, just to the edge of where the light began to fade. Its eyes were huge and completely black, adapted for a world where light was a rare and precious thing. Its skin had a translucent quality, like I could see the darker shapes of organs beneath the surface, but it was the intelligence in those eyes that made my hands shake. This wasn't some primitive deep-sea fish. This was something that understood what a submersible was, what the lights meant, what the cameras were for. Something that was studying me just as intently as I was studying it. I reached for the radio, then stopped. What was I going to say? That I'd found a humanoid creature at 6,000 meters depth? That it was copying my movements and seemed to understand human technology? They'd think I was having pressure psychosis. Hell, maybe I was. The creature swam in a slow circle around the Dagon, always staying just within the light. When it completed the circle, it hung motionless in the water, watching me through the viewport. Then it opened its mouth and spoke. I couldn't hear anything through the pressure hull, but I could see its lips moving, forming shapes that looked disturbingly like words, like it was trying to communicate in a language it had learned by watching, like it was trying to say my name. Then something moved in the darkness beyond the creature, something so massive that my brain struggled to process what I was seeing. At first I thought it was just a shadow, some trick of the lights reflecting off the canyon walls. But shadows don't have tentacles the size of subway cars. The colossal squid emerged from the deep like something out of a nightmare, its mantle easily 40 feet long with tentacles that stretched beyond the reach of my floodlights. I'd studied specimens before, but this thing was triple the size of anything in the scientific literature. Its eyes were the size of dinner plates, and they were fixed directly on me. "Holy shit," I whispered, grabbing the controls. "Ivan, I've got a massive cephalopod down here. Biggest squid I've ever seen." Static answered me. The radio was completely dead. The squid moved with impossible grace for something so enormous, its tentacles undulating in slow, hypnotic waves. But what made my blood freeze was how precisely it approached the Dagon. This wasn't the random curiosity of a deep-sea animal. This was calculated, deliberate. It wrapped 2 tentacles around the submersible's mechanical arms with surgical precision, the suckers finding purchase on the metal joints. I hit the emergency release, but the creature had already figured out exactly where to apply pressure. The port side arm snapped off with a metallic screech that I felt through the hull. "Come on, come on," I muttered, firing the thrusters at maximum power. The Dagon lurched forward, but the squid's grip held firm. Another tentacle snaked around the starboard sample container, and I watched in horror as it systematically dismantled the equipment I'd spent months preparing. But here's the thing that made my hands shake on the controls. The squid wasn't trying to crack the hull. It was specifically targeting the external equipment, the sample containers, the communication array, like it understood exactly what each piece of gear was for. I spun the external camera around, desperate to get footage of this encounter, and caught sight of the humanoid creature floating about 20 feet away. It was pulsing with bioluminescent patterns, complex sequences of blue and green light that rippled across its translucent skin. The squid's tentacles tightened around the Dagon's hull, and I realized the creature's light show wasn't random. Every time it flashed a particular pattern, the squid would shift its grip or change its angle of attack. The thing was giving orders. "No way," I breathed. "You're controlling it." The humanoid creature's eyes met mine through the viewport, and its bioluminescent display intensified. The squid immediately released my ballast controls and wrapped a massive tentacle around the communication array, crushing it like aluminum foil. I slammed the emergency ascent button, but the damaged ballast system responded with sluggish groans instead of the sharp hiss of compressed air. The depth gauge flickered between readings, and I realized I was trapped down here with equipment that might not be able to get me back to the surface. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the attack stopped. The squid released a cloud of ink so thick it turned my entire viewport black. And when the murky water finally cleared, the massive creature was gone, just vanished into the deep like it had never existed. The humanoid creature remained, floating motionless in the water. Then it began to swim in a slow, deliberate pattern, away from me, then back, then away again. like a dog trying to get its owner to follow. I checked my systems. The mechanical arms were gone. Half my sample containers were destroyed, and the ballast system was operating at maybe 60% capacity. The communication array was completely dead. No way to contact the surface, no way to call for help. The creature repeated its pattern, swimming toward the deeper canyon and returning to my position. When I didn't move, it began pulsing with those same bioluminescent patterns it had used to control the squid. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to attempt emergency ascent, to get back to the surface before my damaged systems failed completely. But something about the creature's behavior felt almost urgent, like it was trying to show me something important. I made a decision that would probably get me killed. I followed it. The creature led me deeper into the canyon, swimming with fluid grace through water that felt thick as syrup at this depth. My depth gauge flickered between readings, but the last stable number I'd seen was 700 meters, deeper than any human had ever gone before. The Dagon's lights swept across ancient rock formations that looked like they'd been carved by centuries of deep-sea currents. The creature stayed just ahead of me, glancing back occasionally to make sure I was following. Its bioluminescent patterns had shifted to a steady, rhythmic pulse that seemed to match the failing electrical systems in my submersible. That's when I realized something that made my stomach drop. The squid attack hadn't been random predation. It had been orchestrated. The creature had used the squid like a tool, directing it to disable specific systems without killing me. It had wanted me isolated, cut off from the surface, dependent on following its lead. But why? What could possibly be down here that it needed to show me? The creature stopped at the edge of a massive underwater cliff and began pulsing with increasingly complex light patterns. I maneuvered the Dagon to the cliff's edge and aimed my remaining floodlights into the darkness below. What I saw made me forget how to breathe. On the surface, Ivan was frantically adjusting the radio equipment, trying to raise me on any frequency. I couldn't hear him, but I could imagine his growing panic as my telemetry readings flickered in and out of existence. "Penny," he called across the deck. I'm not getting any response from Robert. All his communication systems just went dark. Penny looked up from her laptop, her face pale. "Ivan, I found something in the historical records. The creatures in these reports, they didn't just mimic human appearance. According to multiple ship logs, they could somehow control other sea life, giant squids, schools of fish, even whales." Ivan's hands froze on the radio controls. "What do you mean, control them?" "Like they were using them as weapons," Penny said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The ships that disappeared, they weren't just attacked by the creatures themselves, they were attacked by everything in the ocean." The creature swam with deliberate purpose toward what looked like another rock formation. But as my lights swept across it, I realized I was staring at something that shouldn't exist at this depth. Wood. Actual wooden planks, and what remained of masts jutting out from the canyon wall like the skeleton of some ancient beast. "A shipwreck," I whispered, maneuvering the Dagon closer. "How the hell is there a wooden ship down here?" The vessel was massive, maybe 150 feet long, embedded so deeply in the canyon wall that it looked like the rock had grown around it. The wood should have rotted away decades ago at this depth, but the cold water and lack of oxygen had preserved it like some kind of underwater museum exhibit. The creature floated beside the ship's broken mainmast, watching me with those huge black eyes. When I didn't move closer, it swam to what looked like a gaping hole in the vessel's side and gestured for me to follow. Every instinct I had screamed at me to start emergency ascent procedures. My ballast system was compromised, my communications were dead, and I was following some unknown deep-sea creature into the bowels of a centuries-old shipwreck. This was exactly how maritime disasters happened, but the alternative was trying to surface with a 60% functional ballast system, hoping I could make it 7,000 meters without the remaining equipment failing completely. At least inside the ship, I'd have some protection if the creature decided to summon another giant squid. I eased the Dagon through the hole in the hull, using what remained of my maneuvering thrusters to navigate between broken timbers and collapsed deck planking. My lights revealed a cargo hold filled with debris, rotted rope, corroded metal fittings, and scattered white shapes that made my stomach clench. Bones, human bones scattered across the ship's interior like discarded toys. Jesus, I breathed, counting what looked like dozens of skeletons mixed in with the wreckage. What happened to this crew? The creature appeared outside one of the ship's windows, tapping gently on the glass with one elongated finger. It pointed upward, toward what might have been the captain's quarters on the upper deck. When I hesitated, it repeated the gesture more urgently. I guided the Dagon up through a collapsed section of the ship's interior, careful not to snag the pressure hull on any protruding beams. The captain's quarters were remarkably intact. A wooden desk still bolted to the floor, a chair overturned but unbroken, and shelves lined with what remained of nautical instruments. Something wrapped in dark cloth sat on the desk, perfectly preserved in the cold water. I extended the Dagon's remaining mechanical arm and carefully retrieved the object, bringing it into the sample compartment through the airlock. Once the chamber pressurized, I opened the inner seal and examined what I'd found. Oiled canvas wrapped around what felt like a book. I carefully unfolded the protective covering, revealing a leather-bound journal with pages that were somehow still legible after God knows how many years underwater. The cover was embossed with faded gold lettering. Captain Thomas Peterson, Merchant Vessel Prosperity, 1847. 1847. Ivan had mentioned that date, one of the years when ships went missing in this area. I opened the journal to a random page and read by the Dagon's interior lighting. Day 12. The creatures have been following us for nearly 2 weeks now. At first we thought them mermaids or some manner of sea spirit, for they appear as beautiful women with long flowing hair. But Jenkins swears he saw one change its face whilst watching through the spyglass. One moment a comely maiden, the next bearing the exact features of his departed wife. My hands were shaking as I turned the pages. The entries grew increasingly desperate. Day 15. They are not women at all, but some manner of siren that can take any form they choose. This morning I saw one that bore my own face looking back at me from the water. When I called to my crew to witness it, the thing smiled with my own mouth but showed teeth like a shark's. I looked up from the journal. Through the viewport, the creature was floating just outside the captain's quarters, and my blood turned to ice. Its face had changed. The elongated features were still there, the translucent skin and oversized eyes, but underneath it all was something that looked disturbingly familiar. It looked like me. Not exactly. Like someone had taken my features and stretched them to fit an alien bone structure. My dark hair, my jawline, even the way I frowned when concentrating. But those predatory teeth were still visible when it opened its mouth in what might have been meant as a smile. I turned back to the journal with trembling fingers. Day 18. They have learned to control the beasts of the deep. Yesterday, a great squid near twice the size of our ship attacked on their command, destroying our rudder and cracking our mainmast. They are herding us toward some purpose I dare not contemplate. Day 20. God help us, they can speak now, using our own voices, calling our own names from the water. Young Morrison threw himself overboard when he heard his mother calling to him, only to discover the creature wearing her face as it dragged him beneath the waves. Final entry. They have driven us into the deep canyon where no rescue shall find us. The great squid has holed our ship, and we are taking on water faster than the pumps can manage. But that is not the worst of it. The sirens have been studying us, learning our ways. I have seen them practicing human gestures, human expressions. They mean to take our faces, our voices, our very selves back to the world above. God forgive me for what I have brought upon the world. If any soul finds this record, know that they are not what they appear to be. Trust no face you have seen taken by the deep. The journal ended there. The final page is too water-damaged to read. I sat in the Dagon's cramped cockpit, staring at evidence that my mother had been right about everything. The creatures were real. They'd been hunting humans for centuries, and they could perfectly mimic human appearance. And now one of them was wearing my face. Through the viewport, the Robert creature pressed its palm against the glass and mouthed words I could lip read. "Robert, help me." It was using my voice. I couldn't hear it through the water and the hull, but I could see the shape of my own name on lips that looked exactly like mine. The thing had been studying me from the moment I'd encountered it. Every movement, every expression, every gesture I'd made while piloting the submersible. And now it was ready to take my place. I clutched Captain Peterson's journal and finally understood what my mother had been trying to warn me about. These weren't just deep-sea creatures. They were hunters who had perfected the ultimate camouflage. They could become anyone, replace anyone, infiltrate any community without detection. The creature outside began making more complex gestures, pointing upward toward the surface, toward Ivan and Penny, who would be expecting Robert Mendez to emerge from this dive. But which Robert would they get? I slammed my fist against the emergency ballast release, but the damaged system wheezed instead of the sharp blast of compressed air I needed. The depth gauge flickered between 7,100 and 6,900 meters as the Dagon began its painfully slow climb toward the surface. The creature, my doppelganger, swam alongside the ascending submersible with fluid movements that made my clumsy mechanical ascent look pathetic. But what made my hands shake on the controls was how perfectly it had copied me. Not just the general shape of my face, but the exact way my hair fell across my forehead when I leaned forward to read the instruments. The precise angle of my jaw when I concentrated. Even the small scar above my left eyebrow from a childhood accident. It had been studying me for hours, learning every detail, and now it looked more like Robert Mendez than I did. I tried the radio again, desperate to warn Ivan about what was coming to the surface. Static filled my headset, but underneath the white noise I could swear I heard something else, a rhythmic clicking that sounded almost like Morse code. The creatures had done more than just crush my communication array. They'd been listening to every word I'd said to the surface team. The ballast system groaned, releasing another weak burst of air. At this rate, it would take me 3 hours to reach the surface, assuming the remaining equipment didn't fail completely. 3 hours of climbing through dark water with something that could perfectly imitate me swimming just outside the hull. At 6,000 meters, the creature began ramming the Dagon's starboard side with enough force to rattle my teeth. Not random impacts, calculated strikes against specific structural points. It knew exactly where to hit to maximize damage without breaching the hull. "Stop it," I muttered, adjusting the ballast controls again. "Just leave me alone." The creature appeared at the viewport and pressed its face against the glass. When it opened its mouth, I could lip read the words with perfect clarity. "Robert. Help me, Robert." It was using my voice. I couldn't hear the sound through the water and the pressure hull, but I recognized the shape of my own lips forming my own name. The thing had learned to speak like me. Then it smiled, and I saw my own expression reflected back at me. The exact crooked grin I made when I was pleased with a particularly clever observation. The creature had even copied the way my left canine tooth sat slightly forward, a dental imperfection I'd been self-conscious about since high school. The ballast system released another burst of air, and we climbed past 5,500 meters. The creature swam in lazy circles around the ascending submersible, never more than 20 feet away, always visible through one viewport or another, like a shark following wounded prey. At 4,000 meters, my external lights illuminated something that made me forget how to breathe. More of them. Dozens of humanoid figures swimming up from the deep canyon, all moving with the same coordinated grace as the original. As they entered the range of my floodlights, I could see their faces clearly. Every single one looked exactly like me. Not approximate copies or rough imitations. Perfect duplicates down to the smallest detail. They swam in formation around the Dagon like an honor guard, their movements synchronized in ways that human swimmers never could achieve. Some wore expressions I recognized from my own face: concentration, curiosity, determination. Others showed emotions I'd never seen in any mirror: predatory hunger, cold calculation, patient satisfaction. The original creature approached the viewport again and began making complex gestures with its hands. When I didn't respond, it pointed upward toward the surface, then back at itself, then at me. The meaning was unmistakable. It was going up there to take my place. I fumbled for the manual override on the ballast system, trying to force more air into the tanks. The Dagon lurched upward with a metallic groan, but the creature swarm matched my acceleration effortlessly. They weren't trying to stop my ascent. They were escorting me to the surface. That's when I understood the real horror of the situation. These things didn't want to kill me down here in the deep where my body would never be found. They wanted me alive when I reached the surface, so Ivan and Penny could watch the real Robert Mendez emerge from the submersible. Then, sometime later, maybe hours, maybe days, one of the duplicates would return to shore, and no one would ever know the difference. The original creature appeared at the viewport one last time and mouthed 3 words that made my blood freeze. "Thank you, Robert." It had learned everything it needed from me. My voice, my appearance, my mannerisms, probably even my memories from watching me react to familiar equipment and procedures. Now it was ready to go back to the world above and become me. 7,000 feet above us, Ivan was adjusting the radio controls for the 100th time, trying to raise me on any frequency. I could imagine his growing panic as my telemetry readings continued to flicker in and out of existence. That's when his satellite phone rang. He almost ignored it. His attention was focused on the emergency protocols for lost submersibles, but the caller ID made him freeze. Gloria Dunn, Robert's mother, who hadn't contacted the research vessel directly in over 2 years. "Dr. Dunn?" Ivan answered cautiously. "Ivan, listen to me very carefully." Gloria's voice was steady but urgent. "Whatever comes up from that dive, it might not be my son." "I don't understand." "Robert's submersible is ascending now, but his communications are down. 30 years ago, I lost my entire research team in that exact location." Gloria interrupted. "The creatures down there don't just kill people, Ivan. They replace them." Ivan's hands went cold on the phone. "What are you talking about?" "They're perfect mimics. They study their targets, learn everything about them, then take their place. I've been tracking them ever since they took my team, waiting for them to surface again." Through the radio static, Ivan could hear the faint ping of the Dagon's emergency beacon. The submersible was rising steadily, right on schedule for a normal ascent. "Dr. Dunn, I need you to explain this more clearly." "I'm already in a Coast Guard helicopter," Gloria said. "Caden Lucas is flying me to your position. We'll be there in 20 minutes. Whatever you do, don't let anything that looks like Robert back onto that ship until I can verify it's really him." The line went dead, leaving Ivan staring at the phone while the emergency beacon continued its steady approach toward the surface. The helicopter's rotors cut through the ocean air 20 minutes later, exactly when my mother said they would. I wasn't there to see it. I was still climbing through 7,000 feet of dark water with a swarm of creatures wearing my face. But Ivan told me later that he'd never seen anything like what stepped off that Coast Guard aircraft. My mother wasn't the scattered, paranoid woman I'd been documenting for years. She moved across the research vessel's deck with the focused efficiency of someone who'd been preparing for this exact moment for 3 decades. 2 large waterproof cases came with her. Equipment I'd never seen before despite years of dismissing her hobby projects in Dad's old workshop. "Where's the sonar array?" she asked Ivan without any greeting, already unpacking what looked like a sophisticated underwater detection system. "I need to see how many are rising." Caden Lucas followed her off the helicopter, his Coast Guard bearings suggesting this wasn't a routine rescue operation anymore. "Dr. Dunn briefed me during the flight," he told Ivan. "We need to establish a security perimeter immediately. No vessels in or out until we understand what we're dealing with." While Penny helped connect my mother's equipment to the ship's power system, Ivan tried to process what he was hearing. "Dr. Dunn, you said these creatures took your research team in 1994? My mother's hands never stopped moving as she calibrated her homemade sonar array. "March 15th, 1994. We were studying thermal vents at the deepest part of the trench when they attacked. 5 researchers, including myself. I was the only one who made it back to the surface." The equipment hummed to life, displaying a 3-dimensional representation of the water beneath them. Ivan stared at the screen as dozens of moving signatures appeared, all rising steadily from the deep canyon. "The official report said equipment malfunction," Penny said quietly. "Pressure suit failure. That's what I told them." My mother adjusted the sonar gain, bringing the ascending signatures into sharper focus. "Would you have believed me if I described what really happened? Humanoid creatures that could perfectly mimic human appearance, controlling giant squids to destroy our equipment." Ivan watched the moving dots on the sonar display climb toward the surface. Each signature was roughly human-sized, moving in coordinated formations that no natural sea life would maintain. "These readings, there are so many of them." "More than I've ever recorded," my mother confirmed, her voice tight with concern. "In 1994, we encountered maybe 6 individuals. This shows at least 40 signatures, possibly more outside the sonar range." Penny was frantically cross-referencing data on her laptop. "The shipping records I researched earlier, if I overlay them with a timeline." She paused, her face going pale. 28 years. The disappearances follow a precise 28-year cycle. "That's their breeding period," my mother explained while monitoring the ascending creatures. "They surface to hunt and reproduce, then return to the deep for nearly 3 decades. The cycle has repeated for centuries, maybe longer." Caden was already radioing his unit, establishing a 5-mile perimeter around our research vessel. "All Coast Guard vessels. This is Officer Lucas. We have a potential biological hazard in the water. No boats approach the research station until further notice." Ivan realized the horrifying timing. Robert's dive coincided exactly with their emergence from dormancy. He's the first human they've encountered in 28 years. "Which means they've had time to study him extensively," my mother said. "To learn everything about his appearance, his mannerisms, his voice patterns. By now, they can probably mimic him perfectly." The sonar signatures continued their steady ascent, now at 4,000 meters and climbing. Penny's data correlation was painting an even grimmer picture as she traced the historical pattern. "Every 28 years, ships disappear in this area with no survivors," she reported. "But here's what's really disturbing. Sometimes people who were supposedly lost at sea turned up weeks or months later in coastal towns. They claimed to be survivors, had perfect memories of their identities. Families accepted them without question. My mother's equipment detected something that made her hands freeze on the controls. They're not just coming up to hunt this time. Look at the formation patterns. The sonar showed the creatures arranging themselves in precise groups, maintaining specific distances and coordinated movements that suggested advanced planning rather than instinctive behavior. They're organized, Caden observed, his military training recognizing tactical formations when he saw them. This isn't random predation. It's a coordinated operation. That's what I've been trying to tell everyone for 30 years, my mother said. These aren't just deep-sea animals acting on instinct. They're intelligent. They plan. And they've been studying human society every time they surface. Ivan stared at the sonar display showing dozens of Robert-shaped signatures approaching the surface. How are we supposed to identify the real Robert among all of them? That's the problem, my mother replied grimly. Once they perfect the mimicry, it's almost impossible to tell the difference. The creature that reaches the surface could maintain Robert's identity for years, decades even. It could return to his job, interact with his colleagues, live his entire life without anyone knowing the real Robert died 7,000 feet underwater. The first signatures reached 2,000 meters. Caden coordinated with his Coast Guard perimeter, but everyone understood the fundamental problem. How do you fight an enemy that looks exactly like the person you're trying to save? Penny's research was revealing the scope of the threat. If the 28-year cycle holds true, and they've been breeding during dormancy, then this emergence represents the largest group in recorded history. The sonar signatures climbed past 1,000 meters, close enough now that individual shapes were becoming distinct on the display. Each one moved with the fluid grace of a creature perfectly adapted for deep-sea life. But their formation patterns suggested human-level intelligence and planning. "We're watching an invasion," Caden said quietly, his hand moving instinctively toward his radio to coordinate additional Coast Guard resources. My mother's equipment registered the first signatures approaching 500 meters depth. Soon they would breach the surface, and the question of which Robert was real would become a matter of life and death for everyone on the research vessel. "Whatever comes up from that water," she warned the team, "remember that it's been studying my son for hours. It knows everything about him that can be observed. The only way to identify the real Robert is through something private, something only he would know." But even as she said it, my mother understood the terrible reality they faced. These creatures had been perfecting their mimicry for centuries, and they were about to test their skills against humans who had no experience fighting an enemy that could become anyone. The Dagon's hull groaned as we finally broke through the surface tension, and I've never been so happy to see gray ocean sky in my entire life. But my relief lasted about 3 seconds before I looked through the viewport and saw them. 12 figures treading water in a perfect circle around my submersible. All of them looked exactly like me, not similar, not close. Exactly like Robert Mendez, down to the small scar above my left eyebrow and the way my hair stuck up when it got wet. They floated motionless in the choppy waves, their dark eyes fixed on the research vessel 50 yards away, where I could see Ivan frantically waving at the Coast Guard helicopter, hovering overhead. My hands shook as I tried the radio one more time. Still nothing but static from the damaged communication array. Through the viewport, I watched one of the duplicates swim closer to my submersible. It pressed its face against the glass and smiled with my own crooked grin, then pointed toward the research vessel where my teammates were waiting. The thing mouthed words I could lip read perfectly. "Time to go home, Robert." That's when I realized the creature's plan wasn't just to replace me. They were going to let me reach the surface so Ivan and the others could see the real Robert Mendez emerge from the submersible. Then, later tonight or tomorrow or next week, one of the duplicates would return to shore, and nobody would ever question which Robert was which. I fumbled with the emergency hatch controls, my mind racing through everything Ivan and I had shared over 3 years of working together. Private jokes, embarrassing stories, random observations that nobody else would know. The creatures had watched me for hours, but they couldn't have learned everything about my life before I started this dive. The submersible's ballast tanks hissed as I prepared for surface recovery, and through the radio static I finally heard Ivan's voice calling my name. The signal was weak and broken, but I caught enough words to understand he was directing the Coast Guard team to extract me. That's when I remembered something from graduate school that no creature could possibly know about. During our first semester at Scripps, Ivan and I had gotten completely drunk after failing a particularly brutal exam on deep-sea pressure dynamics. We'd invented a stupid hand gesture, touching your nose with your left index finger while making an OK sign with your right hand, that we called the pressure relief signal. We'd used it exactly twice, once that night when we were too drunk to speak coherently, and once the following week when Ivan got seasick during a research cruise and needed to communicate that he was okay without opening his mouth. It was ridiculous and embarrassing, and absolutely something only Ivan would recognize. I positioned myself directly in front of the main viewport and waited until I saw Ivan on the research vessel's deck, binoculars trained on my submersible. Then I pressed my face against the glass and performed our idiotic graduate school gesture as clearly as possible. The effect was immediate. Ivan dropped the binoculars and started shouting at someone off deck, pointing directly at my submersible while gesturing frantically at the Coast Guard crew. I couldn't hear his words through the water and damaged hull, but I could see him arguing with what looked like my mother. When the hell had she gotten here? And a Coast Guard officer in an orange flight suit. One of the duplicates began swimming toward the research vessel, moving with fluid grace that looked perfectly natural until you realized no human could maintain that kind of efficiency in choppy surface conditions. It had apparently decided to take the initiative while the real Robert was still trapped in his metal can. That's when the Coast Guard helicopter dropped something into the water that changed everything. The sonic charge detonated 20 feet from the nearest duplicate, sending a pressure wave through the ocean that I felt even inside the Dagon's hull. The creature's perfect human facade shattered as the sound hit it. Its movements became jerky and unnatural, like a marionette with tangled strings. The thing that had been wearing my face opened its mouth in what must have been a shriek, though I couldn't hear it through the water. All 12 duplicates dove beneath the surface simultaneously, their coordinated movements proving they weren't acting on individual panic, but following some kind of group directive. Within seconds, the water around my submersible was empty, except for the Coast Guard recovery team approaching in a rubber Zodiac. 20 minutes later, I was sitting on the research vessel's deck with a thermal blanket wrapped around my shoulders, Captain Peterson's journal clutched in my hands like a lifeline. My mother, who looked nothing like the scattered, paranoid woman I'd been documenting for years, knelt beside me, checking my eyes for signs of pressure sickness or nitrogen narcosis. "How did you know?" I asked her. "How did you know they were down there?" "Because I've been tracking them for 30 years, she said simply. "Ever since they killed my research team and I barely made it back alive. Everything you thought was paranoid delusion was actually data collection, Robert. I've been monitoring their sonar signatures, studying their movement patterns, preparing for the day they'd surface again." Ivan approached, carrying a water sample container, his expression a mixture of relief and scientific fascination. The creatures disappeared completely after the sonic charges. Whatever those were, they don't like loud underwater sounds. Probably interferes with their echolocation or communication systems, my mother said, standing up and brushing off her knees. I'll need to analyze the frequency response to understand their specific vulnerabilities. Penny was already at her laptop, cross-referencing data, while Caden coordinated with additional Coast Guard vessels to maintain the security perimeter. The helicopter circled overhead, its crew scanning the water for any sign of the creatures. What were those things? I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew the answer. Exactly what I tried to warn you about, my mother replied. Intelligent predators that have been hunting humans for centuries, possibly longer. They've evolved specifically to infiltrate human society by perfectly mimicking our appearance and behavior. I opened Captain Peterson's journal and showed her the entries describing creatures that could take any face, control giant squids, and drive entire ships into the deep water where rescue was impossible. This happened in 1847, I said. The same thing you encountered in 1994, and now again in 2022. My mother examined the journal with the focused attention of someone who'd been researching this exact phenomenon for 3 decades. The 28-year cycle. They emerge, hunt, breed, then return to dormancy in the deepest parts of the trench. Penny looked up from her computer screen, her face pale. If the historical pattern holds, and they've been breeding during dormancy, then this emergence represents the largest population in recorded history. We could be looking at hundreds of these creatures, not just the 40 we detected on sonar. Ivan handed me the water sample he'd collected during my ascent. Even through the container's plastic walls, I could see strange bioluminescent particles swirling in the seawater. Robert, what exactly did you observe down there? We need to document everything while the details are still fresh. I described the creature's ability to control the giant squid through bioluminescent signals, the coordinated attack on my equipment, and most importantly, the way the thing had systematically learned to mimic my appearance and mannerisms by studying me for hours. They're not just predators, I concluded. They're researchers. They study their targets the same way we study marine life, learning everything about us before they replace us. Caden finished his radio coordination and joined our group. The Coast Guard has established a 10-mile perimeter, but we need to understand what we're dealing with before we decide how to proceed. These creatures could surface anywhere along the coast if they choose to disperse. My mother was analyzing the bioluminescent particles under a portable microscope she'd brought in one of her equipment cases. This compound is unlike anything in current scientific literature. It appears to be some kind of organic technology, a biological system that can generate specific light frequencies for communication and control of other organisms. How is that possible? Ivan asked. Evolution, she replied simply. These creatures have had millions of years to develop biological tools that we're only beginning to understand. They've essentially turned bioluminescence into a sophisticated communication and control system. I thought about the creature wearing my face, the way it had directed the giant squid with precise light patterns, the coordinated movements of the duplicate swarm. They're not just using biological tools, they're using the entire ocean ecosystem as a weapon. Penny's research had uncovered additional historical evidence while we talked. I've found references going back to the 1600s describing similar incidents. Ships reporting crew members who claimed to be survivors of earlier wrecks, coastal communities accepting the return of people who'd been declared dead. If these creatures have been infiltrating human society for centuries. She didn't finish the sentence, but we all understood the implication. How many people throughout history had actually been these creatures wearing human faces? How many coastal communities had been slowly replaced over generations without anyone knowing the difference? The immediate question, Caden said with military pragmatism, is whether this emergence is over or just beginning. Are we looking at a single hunting event, or the start of a coordinated invasion. My mother's sonar equipment showed the creatures had retreated to depths below our detection range, but she wasn't reassured. In 1994, after they killed my team, the creatures disappeared for almost the entire 28-year cycle, but the historical patterns suggest they're getting more sophisticated with each emergence. I looked out at the gray ocean, knowing that somewhere far below us, creatures wearing my face were waiting in the crushing darkness of the deep trench. They'd studied me, learned everything about Robert Mendez that could be observed, and they'd only retreated because the sonic charges had disrupted whatever they were planning. "This isn't over," I said, clutching Captain Peterson's journal. "This was just their first attempt. They've learned about our technology, our response capabilities, our security procedures. Next time they surface, they'll be better prepared." The research vessel rocked gently in the ocean swells while the Coast Guard helicopter maintained its patrol overhead. We'd prevented an immediate threat, but we'd also awakened something that had been perfecting its hunting techniques for centuries. And somewhere in the deepest part of the Puerto Rico Trench, creatures that looked exactly like me were planning their next move. 6 hours later, I sat in the research vessel's cramped laboratory, staring at Captain Peterson's journal, while my mother calibrated something that looked like it belonged in a NASA facility rather than her garage workshop. The pages felt fragile under my fingers, but the ink remained legible enough to make my stomach twist every time I read about the crew members throwing themselves overboard rather than face creatures wearing their loved ones' faces. "Mom." The word came out rougher than I intended. She looked up from her equipment, and for the first time in years, I saw her clearly, not through the lens of psychiatric evaluation forms and involuntary commitment paperwork, but as Dr. Gloria Dunn, marine biologist. The woman who'd been right about everything while I'd been documenting her delusions like some kind of academic vulture. "I owe you an apology that's about 30 years overdue," I said, closing the journal carefully. "Everything you tried to tell me, every warning you gave, every piece of equipment you built in Dad's workshop, you were conducting legitimate scientific research while I was planning to have you institutionalized." Her hands stilled on the controls. "You were what?" Ivan looked up from his data correlation work, and I felt heat crawl up my neck. "I've been meeting with psychiatrists for months, building a case for involuntary commitment. I thought," my voice cracked, "I thought I was saving you from yourself." The silence stretched long enough for me to hear the Coast Guard helicopter changing patrol patterns overhead. When my mother spoke, her voice was steady, but I could see her hands shaking. "Robert, I spent 3 decades knowing that my own son thought I was insane. Do you understand what that does to a person? Having the most important relationship in your life built on the assumption that everything you say is a symptom. I know, and I'm sorry. I was so afraid of losing you the way we lost Dad that I couldn't see you were already gone. Not because you were sick, but because I'd pushed you away." Penny cleared her throat diplomatically. "The bioluminescent analysis is showing some interesting results if you'd like to focus on that." I appreciated her attempt to redirect, but this conversation needed to happen. "Mom, I need you to know that every warning you gave me, every time you called about sonar readings or shipping patterns, you were trying to save my life. And I responded by treating you like a patient instead of listening to you like a scientist." She walked over and sat beside me, close enough that I could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "I forgave you years ago, Robert. I understood why you couldn't believe me. What those creatures do, the way they study us, learn to become us, it's so far outside normal human experience that it sounds impossible. But you never stopped researching." "Because I knew they'd surface again, The 28-year cycle is as reliable as tidal patterns. And I knew that when they did, someone would need to be ready. Ivan joined us at the analysis table, bringing a printout of sonar data. Dr. Dunn, your tracking methods detected their emergence 3 days before we even started the dive. If we'd listened to your warnings, you would have thought I was having another episode, my mother finished. Robert's reaction was completely logical given the information he had. I chose to maintain the appearance of instability because it allowed me to continue my research without interference. Caden approached from the communication station where he'd been coordinating with Coast Guard Command. We need to discuss classification protocols. This information can't reach the public until we develop effective countermeasures. Agreed, Ivan said. I'm recommending we classify the findings under maritime security protocols. Limited distribution to essential personnel only. Penny's laptop screen showed overlapping datasets that painted a picture I didn't want to believe. The bioluminescent compounds from Robert's water sample are unlike anything in current scientific literature. The molecular structure suggests organic technology, biological systems that function like manufactured tools. Meaning what exactly? I asked. Meaning these creatures didn't just evolve to hunt humans, she explained. They evolved specifically to infiltrate human society. This level of biological sophistication represents millions of years of directed evolution toward a single goal. My mother leaned forward to examine Penny's data. That matches my observations from 1994. The creatures didn't just mimic my team members. They studied our equipment, our procedures, our communication methods. They were learning everything about human technology and behavior. Which explains why they're getting more sophisticated with each emergence, Ivan added. Every 28 years, they incorporate new knowledge about human society into their hunting strategies. Caden's radio crackled with updates from the patrol teams. All stations report no surface activity. Deep sonar shows the signatures have retreated to maximum detection range and beyond. They're returning to dormancy, my mother confirmed. The sonic charges disrupted whatever they were planning, so they've gone back to the deepest parts of the trench to wait. For how long? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. If the pattern holds 28 years. But given what happened today, I doubt they'll wait that long. We've shown them our capabilities, our response time, our countermeasures. Next time they surface, they'll be prepared for everything we threw at them. The weight of that settled over the laboratory like fog. We'd won a battle, but we'd also educated our enemy about human defense capabilities. We need a permanent monitoring station, Ivan said. Something that can track their movements during dormancy and detect any changes in their behavior patterns. My mother nodded. I can provide the baseline data and tracking methodologies. 30 years of research that's finally going to be useful for something other than making people think I'm crazy. I want to continue studying them, I said, surprising myself with how certain I sounded. What I experienced down there, the way they study their targets, learn to become them. I'm probably the only person alive who's observed their mimicry process in real time. Robert, that's incredibly dangerous, Ivan protested. You're talking about deliberately putting yourself at risk again. I'm talking about scientific research. These creatures represent the most significant discovery in marine biology, possibly in human history. We can't just wait 28 years and hope they leave us alone. Penny was still analyzing data, but I could see her expression growing more concerned. The historical patterns suggest they're not random in their hunting selection. Ships that disappeared, coastal communities that reported returning survivors. There's a geographic pattern that suggests they're specifically targeting areas with access to major population centers. They're not just hunting, Caden realized. They're conducting reconnaissance, learning about human society so they can integrate more effectively. My mother's equipment beeped softly as it completed another deep water scan. The sonar signatures are definitely at dormancy depth, but the formation patterns are different from what I recorded in previous cycles. They're not scattering randomly. They're maintaining organized groups. Meaning they're still coordinating even in dormancy, I said, planning their next emergence. The research vessel rocked gently in the ocean swells while we processed the implications. Outside the laboratory's small windows, I could see the Coast Guard helicopter maintaining its patrol pattern, but I knew no amount of surface security could protect us from creatures that had spent centuries perfecting their hunting techniques. We need to be ready for them, I said, looking around at the team that had somehow become the world's first official deep-sea creature response unit. Not just with sonic charges and Coast Guard patrols, but with real understanding of what they are and what they want. My mother began packing her equipment with the efficiency of someone who'd spent 30 years working alone. Then we'd better get started, because whatever those creatures are planning in the deep water, they now know exactly what we're capable of stopping. I touched Captain Peterson's journal one more time, thinking about a ship's crew from 1847 who'd faced the same threat with 19th century technology and no understanding of what they were fighting. We had better equipment and more knowledge. But we also faced creatures that had learned from every encounter over the past 175 years. The next time they surfaced, they'd be ready for us. The question was whether we'd be ready for them.